All right, so this is section 5 of chapter 6, and in this section we'll discuss other topics related to internal and external validity, such as balancing internal and external validity, artifacts, and the presence of exaggerated variables. So in the last 3 sections, we've been discussing internal and external validity. And again, these are very important to the integrity of your study. You want to be able to say that your results provide some meaningful insight into the relationship between the variables that you are studying. That's internal validity. And ideally, you want your results to generalize beyond the lab and beyond the particular sample of participants that you're using. That's external validity. So ideally, you want a study that maximizes both types of validity. However, in practice, there's often a trade-off between internal and external validity. So if you really care about internal validity, then you probably want a study that is highly controlled, so as to reduce the possible contamination of confounding variables. But the more controlled a study becomes, the less realistic it often becomes. And perhaps your results may not generalize as well to the real world. So in this case, optimizing for internal validity may come at the cost of external validity. Conversely, if you want a study that feels more authentic and realistic, it's probably going to be less controlled. And therefore, you are increasing external validity, but at the cost of internal validity. So what is the right solution? Well, it's your job as the researcher to weigh the importance of internal and external validity based on the purpose and the goals of your study. So another type of threat to both categories of validity, internal and external, are artifacts. So an artifact is some external factor that can affect the behavior of the people in your study, which is, of course, a problem. Now, two types of artifacts are, one, experimenter bias, and this is when the expectations or the beliefs of the experimenter interfere with the study's findings. Or the second type is demand characteristics, which is when people in your study alter their behavior, perhaps in unnatural ways, because they know that they're in a study and they react to this novel environment, again, sometimes in strange or unnatural ways. So both of these are a threat to internal and external validity, because they may provide an alternative explanation for your findings, which threatens internal validity, and also your findings may not generalize to other settings, which threatens external validity. And please see chapter 3 if you need a refresher on experimenter bias and demand characteristics. All right, so another issue to consider, especially for external validity, is the idea of exaggerated variables. So in order to demonstrate a relationship between variables, in order to detect a difference between conditions, it makes sense to exaggerate the differences between those conditions. So for example, if you are studying the effects of temperature on classroom attention span, you probably don't want to compare 71 degrees and 72 degrees. You probably won't see a big difference. Instead, you might compare 65 degrees and 95 degrees. And so by exaggerating those variables, you increase the probability of detecting a relationship if a relationship really exists. That's the upside. However, on the other hand, you probably won't have such drastic variations in classroom temperature in the real world, which can hurt external validity. Or consider another example. So there are many studies on the effects of recreational drugs in animals. And in some of these studies, you have some poor hamster or some poor rodent, or maybe lucky rodent, depending on your perspective, and you give this rodent like obscene amounts of THC, and then you measure the physiological or medical or psychological effects. And maybe you find that there are some deleterious effects. Now, one problem here is cross-species generalization that we talked about earlier. But another problem could be this problem of exaggerated variables. Because again, in some of these studies, you give animals like ridiculous amounts of drugs that people in the real world probably wouldn't use, which again creates problems for external validity. So again, if your study has exaggerated variables, you have to be careful in generalizing to the real world, where the real world analog of those variables may not be as exaggerated. And finally, let's discuss the relationship between validity and research strategies. So the different research strategies that we've been discussing, descriptive, correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental, these all vary in the emphasis that they place on internal versus external validity. So for example, descriptive studies will often focus on variables in their natural settings, with minimal control or interference from scientists. And therefore, descriptive studies will often prioritize external validity, but typically will have weaker internal validity due to fewer controls. On the other end of that spectrum, you find experimental studies, which typically have rigorous controls and manipulations designed to mitigate the impact of confounding variables and designed to demonstrate cause and effect relationships between variables. Now, all of this raises internal validity, but may limit external validity because oftentimes you create a study that is very artificial and unnatural. And finally, quasi-experimental studies will do a decent job of sort of balancing internal and external validity, but usually without optimizing for either. So what can I say? Life is governed by trade-offs, and scientific research is no different. All right, so that concludes Chapter 6, and I will see you for Chapter 7.